dark, so strange, so Catholic that we just didn't get it. And in particular, we didn't get Zurbarán. These are, let's face it, bizarre and unsettling images. Uncomfortable funerals. Impossible deaths. The Zurbarán family house on the main square in Fuente de Cantos. It's quite a posh house now. Must have been really posh in the 17th century. Zurbarán's father was a prosperous textile merchant from the north, Basque country, who moved down here because southern Spain, particularly Andalusia, was experiencing this boom in new religious building, and there was so much money here for the priests and their new outfits. So there's a lot of work for the Zurbaráns. Many years later, Francisco de Zurbarán painted a mysterious series of Christian martyrs, beautiful female martyrs, all of whom were dressed in modern clothes. They're some of the most beautifully painted and exciting clothes in 17th century Baroque art. And people said that Zurbarán was using his father's textiles in these paintings, advertising them, using these Christian martyrs just to show off what his dad had for sale. Zurbarán's main employers were the Spanish religious orders, the Mercedarians, the Carthusians, the Benedictines, the Dominicans, and the Franciscans. One day, Pope Nicholas V visited Assisi. He wanted to see the crypt where St. Francis was buried. And at 5 in the morning, he went down into the crypt with a band of monks. And all they had with them was torches. And as the torchlight spread around the dark crypt, suddenly they saw St. Francis standing there, 200 years after his death, still as fresh as if he'd just stepped out of a bath, untouched, unblemished, as if time hadn't touched him. Zurbarán went on to do many other things, but monks were his speciality. Monks were where his genius was best expressed. And it's not just the vividness with which he illustrated their uncanny stories, but that sense you get with him that Zurbarán's monks are so convincingly full of God, full of worship, full of thought. No painter has painted human belief as convincingly as this. The Baroque pilgrim, trudging dutifully the 600 miles from Seville to Santiago de Compostela, would have had regular encounters with the Spanish Baroque. And waiting for them at the end of the trudge was an eye-catching eruption of Baroque architecture. You know, Chaucer's Wife of Bath came on the pilgrimage to Santiago. It's been the most famous pilgrimage route in Europe for 1,000 years. But it was the Baroque era that shaped the town itself and gave Santiago de Compostela its memorable and exciting look. The cathedral here, to which thousands of busy pilgrims scuttle daily, is a Baroque wedding cake in the churrigueresque style, which, as far as I can tell, consists chiefly of adding things to places when there isn't really room for them. But somewhere within this crazily writhing, sculpture-encrusted fantasy facade, methinks me sees the remnants of Spain's Islamic past. Inside the great pilgrimage church at Santiago, the Baroque's love of glitter has been spectacularly unleashed. Gilt may have driven the Spanish Baroque, but gold was what paid for it. The stupendous wealth of the American colonies was flooding into Spain, and then into the pockets of the Catholic Church, which spent it, as the Catholic Church so often did, on art. You know, there's never been an art movement as adept as the Baroque was at absorbing local influences, taking them all in, regurgitating them, and then spitting them out at the other end as something that looks unmistakably Baroque. You can't imagine this building in Italy or France or, perish the thought, England. It's obviously from around here, but with all that thrusting and swirling and movement, it's just as obviously Baroque. But there is one huge slab of the world where you can easily imagine this. When I say the Baroque was the first truly international art movement, I mean truly international. The churrigueresque style may not have travelled to Italy or France, but it travelled all right to the far, far corners of the Spanish Empire, where it ended up in some very remote places. Wherever the monks went, the Baroque went, and it ended up as the house style of the whole of Latin America. But not all of the Baroque's travels were quite so exotic. How the Spanish kings came to own Belgium is a dark political story involving so many battles and so much constant religious conflict that would be here for as long as the 100 Years' War trying to understand it fully. Let's just say they were here and they shouldn't have been. In any case, what interests us is the art that came out of the Spanish Netherlands, and for that you need a strong stomach. The Spanish were here for nearly 200 years, but you'd hardly know it. There's so little sign of them left. A few plaques, some statues, and this magnificent Baroque square in the centre of Brussels, the Grote Market. It's as action-packed a square as the Baroque ever produced, with its ring of spiky and busy Baroque buildings. The Grote Market is a 50-course banquet of architecture, in which all the courses are served up at once. Superb building at the end, the House of the Fox. That used to be the headquarters of the Haberdashers' Guild. Next to it, the Guild of the Boatmen. Their centre was in the House of the Horn. See the big gold horn there? But the most interesting for us is the one at the end. See there? That used to be the headquarters of the Bakers' Guild. It's now a pub called the King of Spain. And right on top, a statue of Charles II. Even by the standards of the Habsburgs, Charles was a terrible advertisement for royalty. All those generations of Habsburg inbreeding had turned him into an imbecile. The only surviving son of Philip IV, he couldn't walk or talk till he was 7. And an ageing nurse breastfed him till he reached puberty. Too weak to survive an education, he grew up illiterate and squalid. So they made him King of the Netherlands and named this pub after him. It was a monumental clash of cultures. The Spanish with their black, intense, morbid gloominess, and the fun-loving Flemish with their naughty, juicy, fleshy lust for life were never going to see eye to eye. But somehow the coming together of these two momentous opposites squeezed so much monumental art into the world. I probably don't need to tell you who the best known representative was of the Flemish tendency. His notoriety goes before him. He's one of those artists who seems to have nothing much to say to the modern world. So our times have taken a dislike to him, but not me. I've got all the time in the world for Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens shouldn't be out of fashion. An artist as great as him should never be out of fashion. This was one of the towering geniuses of art. A serial achiever on so many Baroque fronts. For instance, he designed that. And this tower here. And he painted that. But he's notorious, of course, for his love of fat women. The adjective Rubenesque has entered our language to describe the Dawn French type. The big un, the size 16er. And there's no point denying Rubens liked the fuller figure. Rubens's art bulges at the seams with a huge tonnage of happily wobbling cellulite. The bigger woman rang his bell and squeezed his pips. But he wasn't alone in that. That's how the Flemish like their women. Rubens's career coincided neatly with that rare thing in Flanders, some decent Spanish leadership. In fact, there were two governors overseeing the Spanish Netherlands in tandem, the conjoined married pair of archdukes, Albert over here, and Isabella. Albert and Isabella ruled here from 1598 to 1621. She was Philip II's daughter. He was the same king's nephew, so they were actually Habsburg cousins and should never have married. But when Philip II made them the joint governors of the Spanish Netherlands, Albert and Isabella surprised everyone by being rather good at ruling the Belgians. And their arrival put a stop, temporarily at least, to the constant round of Flemish warfare. And it was in this period of peace and prosperity that Rubens began to operate. Rubens, interestingly, had been born a Protestant. His father was a Flemish convert to Calvinism. But when the father died, the family converted back to Catholicism. And you'd never guess from Rubens's Catholic handiwork that he'd ever been away from the faith. This stupendous masterclass in Baroque movement and emotion, the Descent from the Cross in Antwerp Cathedral, is Rubens's greatest moment as a creator of thunderous religious theatre. If this doesn't move you, you've got no soul. The young Rubens unleashed sex and violence on us too in this scary Baroque manner. It's hard to believe what's going on here. And my God, will you look at that? But let's not be hypocritical about these dark and tremendous action pictures. Judging by the stuff that pours out of our cinemas today, a taste for this has always been in us. Rubens was merely early in admitting it. If you know Rubens only for his naked orgies and his show-off mythologies, you might be surprised to discover that he had a quiet side, a lovely, gentle aspect. Rubens couldn't stop painting. He was a tap that couldn't be turned off. It was habitual for him, a necessity. So when the King of Spain wasn't commissioning him, Rubens painted something much closer to hand instead. His family. Just for himself. Just for the pleasure of it. His first wife, the charismatic and eager-eyed Isabella Brandt, had died tragically young in 1626. Rubens was devastated. He'd put so much love into painting the two of them, sitting there in their Sunday best, two cooing lovebirds in a bower. But it was his second wife, Hélène Formant, who played the largest part in his art. He married her when he was 53. She was only 16. She's that fleshy, blonde nude who appears in so many of his mythologies. The best model ever for the Rubens girl. You can definitely tell from his art how much he wanted her. The many portrayals of Hélène Formant sizzle with lust. The joyous lust of a 53-year-old man who's hit lucky with a beautiful 16-year-old girl. It doesn't sound good, I grant you, but he loved her and he wanted her, and it shows. Never before in art have we been granted this much access to the private life of a celebrity artist. 400 years before Hello magazine, Rubens had already realised that the world was now fascinated by everything he did. That's how ahead of the times he was. That's how Baroque he was. Rubens spoke 6 languages fluently, and he moved easily among kings and popes. He was the consummate schmoozer. So, in 1629, the Spanish king sent him to England to schmooze Charles I, which Rubens successfully did. So Charles knighted him, and the University of Cambridge made Sir Peter Paul Rubens a Master of Arts. Soon enough, the Baroque would follow Rubens to England. But first, there were still lands to conquer closer to home, just a border away to the north. Welcome to Holland, the wettest stage in the Baroque's great journey from Rome to London, from St. Peter's to St. Paul's. So far in this series, we've been investigating the Catholics. They invented the Baroque. It was their movement, their mindset. It reflected their passions, their hopes, their fears. But, as any mother will tell you, babies don't always grow up as you expect them to. And that was definitely true of the Baroque. By the time it got here, to Holland, it was much too big and boisterous an art movement to be controlled by one religion or one mindset. Indeed, one of the most remarkable things about the Baroque is how brilliantly, how confidently and inventively it switched its allegiance from the Catholics to the Protestants. The greatest Dutch painter of them all, Rembrandt, was a classic Baroque hero. Intense, dramatic, and ambiguous. Rembrandt was born a Protestant here in Leiden, a fierce Calvinist stronghold on the edge of Holland. But to make it, he had to leave Leiden and move here to Amsterdam, where he turned very Baroque and quickly made his mark. All that's actually happening in Rembrandt's tumultuous night watch is that a company of home guards, a Dutch dad's army, is setting out on its daily march around the town. But the sense of occasion here, the emotion, the movement, the drama, is so big and so Baroque, you'd think they were off to save the world. Leiden may have been a Calvinist stronghold, but Rembrandt's mother actually came from an old Catholic family. And to my eyes, he inherited a popish intensity from her, a Catholic fretfulness and sweatiness that gives all of his art its biblical air. Rembrandt couldn't keep out of his own art. This intense little man from Leiden took such a shine to his own face. He kept painting it and repainting it, more often than any artist had ever done before him. In 1635, he showed himself flush with Amsterdam success, celebrating his early good times with his beloved wife, Saskia. But even here, there's doubt in the air. Rembrandt's self-portraits lead you on a merry goose chase as they peep in and out of his soul. I'm particularly fond of this mysterious bit of method acting painted near the end of his life, the self-portrait with circles. Why is he standing there with two big circles painted on the wall behind him? There have been lots of interpretations, but the one that convinces me involves an old story that was told about Phidias, the greatest painter of classical times. Phidias was famous for being able to draw a perfect circle freehand without a compass. And Rembrandt, in his aging self-portrait with circles, is surely saying, I can do that too. But he's not saying it with great conviction, is he? Because there's always so much doubt in Rembrandt. So much hesitation. A sadness that draws you towards his irresistible vulnerability, like a magnet. And this realization that the problems of an artist, his insecurities and inner life were worthy of a picture, was one of the Baroque's most brilliant insights. It was the first art movement to realize that people are as interested in weakness as they are in strength, that doubts are as compelling as achievements, and that the real hero is sometimes the underdog. Protestant Holland put the ordinary doubts of ordinary people at the centre of art. You didn't have to be a pope or a king or a mythological hero to deserve your place in art. Everybody deserved their place in art. You see that chap up there, second from the left at the top, right at the back of this busy crowd scene? Do you know who that is? He's a personal hero of mine, one of the great geniuses of the Dutch Baroque, an artist blessed with some of the fastest hands in art. That is Frans Hals. Frans Hals is perhaps best known for painting this smirking chappie, known to us all as the Laughing Cavalier. In fact, he isn't laughing and he isn't a cavalier. He's an unknown Dutch bravo, exuding such excellent nonchalance. These chaps here were all members of another of these Dad's Army brigades, a squad of amateur soldiers from Haarlem called the Civic Guard of St. George. In theory, they were there to protect the city in times of war. In practice, they met a few times a month and socialized energetically. This is their end-of-term photograph, in which everyone in the class poses for a picture. These things are really tricky to paint. With a king or a pope, you just put them in the center of the picture and that's that. But the Protestant democratization of art caused all sorts of compositional problems. Here you have 15 people, all of whom have paid to appear in this picture, and all of whom expect to be seen properly. House was a genius at getting that right. Look how skillfully he arranges them around the table, turning this way and that. A couple at the front, some at the back. It's a magnificent piece of human orchestration, and it creates that restless sense of movement, of the action swirling about the picture that is so quintessentially Baroque. And there's something else, something even more Baroque than all this restlessness. These men are meant to be soldiers, but you never see them fighting. They're meant to be civic heroes, but there's no aggression in their eyes. The St. George Civic Guard, of which House himself was a member, is instead always shown banqueting and chatting and bonding. That's because these showy banqueting scenes are actually subtle pieces of Baroque propaganda for peace. Holland had seen so many wars and squabbles and wished so desperately for them to end. But instead of coming out with that in some aggressive propagandist way, House implies it subtly, sneakily, baroquely. God's great bounty should not be squandered on war and conflict. This subliminal moralizing became the chief obsession of the Dutch Baroque. You can't trust any of this art to mean what it seems to mean. Especially not when it's been painted by that elusive Dutch genius who smuggled the most subtle subliminal messages into his pictures. Jan Vermeer of Delft. I'm like everyone else. I love Vermeer. Those frugal and tearful women of his, lost in their own thoughts, trying to read a love letter as the weak light of Delft struggles through their window. They claw at my masculine attention. I can't resist them. But Vermeer is as much of a moralist as the rest of them. His beautiful and thoughtful women, dreaming of their loved ones, strumming their guitars, tinkling at their virginals, demand that you note their fragility and breakability as they offer themselves up so sadly for your inspection. These are moods so delicate that the lightest knock would shatter them like crystal. A climatic nuance, a shadow, a touch, a gesture. The final meaning of life is conveyed in such subtle ways. In the end, what's being understood here is the fragility of life itself, the vulnerability of beauty, the shortness of youth. And the fact that some, or even most, of Vermeer's girls with pearl earrings were probably the painter's own daughters adds so much poignancy to his message and personalises it so baroquely. These are not theoretical understandings that are being passed on to us here. These are understandings born of fatherhood and observation. Vermeer himself was a thoroughly obscure figure, completely forgotten for 300 years before the 19th century rediscovered him. But this lack of reliable fame seems somehow to supplement the meaning of his pictures. Here today, gone tomorrow. That's the artist's life for you. The golden age of Dutch art spewed out so many fascinating painters. And I'd be happy to spend many months here remembering them for you. But staying put is not Baroque behaviour. This series promised to take you from St. Peter's over here to St. Paul's over there. And that means we've got some water to cross.